The security guard couldn't help himself. He kept staring at the old man's worn-out shoes, whispering jokes and shaking his head as the elderly visitor shuffled slowly through the gleaming government building. To him, the cracked leather and scuffed soles were an easy target, proof the man didn't belong here, just another forgotten figure trying to sneak past the velvet ropes. But then the elevator doors slid open, and 3 men in immaculate military dress uniforms stepped out. Their eyes locked onto the old man immediately, and without hesitation, they snapped to attention and rendered crisp salutes that echoed through the polished lobby. The guard's smirk froze as his laughter died in his throat. In that moment, the old man's battered shoes told a story the guard hadn't begun to understand. A story of sacrifice, resilience, and honor that no shiny uniform could outshine. The very presence of those saluting soldiers transformed the room's atmosphere, turning what had been quiet mockery into stunned respect. Sometimes, the most important people in the room wear shoes that show their journey, not their status. And the security guard was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Welcome to the silent ranks. Before we continue with this powerful story of respect and recognition, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe that dignity should never be judged by appearance, please hit that subscribe button to join our community of people who understand that true worth isn't measured by what someone wears. The Ronald Reagan Federal Building in downtown Los Angeles stood 34 stories high, its glass and steel facade reflecting the California sun onto the busy streets below. Inside, the lobby was all polished marble and chrome, designed to impress visitors with the power and importance of the federal government. Security checkpoints flanked the main entrance, complete with metal detectors, X-ray machines, and guards who took their authority seriously, perhaps more seriously than the situation warranted. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when Robert Chin shuffled through the main entrance, moving slowly but with purpose toward the security checkpoint. At 78 years old, Robert's body showed the wear of decades, but his spine remained straight and his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses that had been repaired multiple times with electrical tape. He wore a simple white button-down shirt that had been carefully pressed despite its obvious age, dark slacks that had seen better years, and shoes that told a story of their own. The shoes were brown leather, once good quality, but now worn smooth on the bottom from countless miles of walking. The leather was cracked along the stress points, repaired in several places with shoe glue that had yellowed with age. One sole had separated slightly from the upper, creating a small gap that Robert had tried to fix with duct tape that was now gray and frayed. They were the shoes of a man who made them last because he had to, not because he wanted to. Robert carried a manila folder containing documents he'd been asked to review for a military history project. The Department of Defense was compiling records of Medal of Honor recipients for a new digital archive, and they had requested that surviving recipients visit various federal buildings to verify information and provide additional details about their service. It was a routine administrative task, but Robert had dressed as formally as his limited wardrobe allowed, understanding that government buildings deserved respect even for mundane appointments. The security guard manning the main checkpoint was Marcus Thompson, 26 years old and relatively new to the job. Marcus had been working federal security for 8 months, and he developed what he considered a keen eye for the types of people who belonged in important government buildings and those who didn't. He wore his uniform with pride, kept his badge polished, and believed that maintaining proper standards meant keeping undesirable elements from disrupting the serious business of government. Marcus was tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair and the kind of confidence that came from having clear authority in a specific domain. He'd grown up in comfortable suburbs, attended community college on his parents' dime, and had never known real financial hardship. To Marcus, appearance was a reliable indicator of status, success, and worthiness of respect. People who dressed well belonged in places like this. People who didn't were probably looking for handouts or causing trouble. When Robert approached the security checkpoint, Marcus immediately noticed the old man's shoes. In a building where most visitors wore expensive suits and polished leather footwear, Robert's patched and tape-wrapped shoes stood out like a beacon of poverty. Marcus's first instinct was professional courtesy, but as Robert slowly removed his belt and emptied his pockets for the screening process, Marcus found himself focusing more on the man's shabby appearance than on his security responsibilities. "Sir, Please step through the metal detector, Marcus said, his tone already carrying a hint of condescension. Robert moved slowly but cooperatively through the screening process. His movements were deliberate rather than hesitant, the careful motions of someone whose body no longer moved with youthful ease but whose mind remained sharp and focused. He answered Marcus's routine security questions politely, produced identification when requested, and explained that he had an appointment with the Veterans Affairs Liaison Office on the 15th floor. As Robert collected his belongings from the X-ray conveyor belt, Marcus noticed that several other visitors had gathered in the lobby area. A businessman checking his phone, 2 women in professional attire discussing their meeting schedule, and a young intern clutching a coffee cup were all within earshot of the security checkpoint. Marcus saw an opportunity for entertainment. "Hey, check out Grandpa's shoes," Marcus said loudly enough for the nearby visitors to hear, pointing obviously at Robert's feet. "Looks like someone's been walking to Washington from here. Maybe we should start a collection to get him some new ones." The businessman glanced up from his phone with mild interest. The 2 professional women looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. The intern smirked and pulled out her phone, apparently considering whether the situation was worth recording for social media. Robert heard the comment, but continued gathering his belongings without reaction. He'd learned long ago that responding to every slight or insult was a waste of energy better spent on more important things. He slipped his belt back through the loops of his pants, folded his identification back into his wallet, and prepared to head toward the elevators. But Marcus wasn't finished. Emboldened by what he perceived as Robert's weakness and the attention of the small audience, he decided to continue his performance. "Seriously, old man, did you walk here from a homeless shelter? Those shoes are held together with duct tape and prayers. This is a federal building, not a soup kitchen. Maybe you should try the welfare office down the street instead." The businessman looked increasingly uncomfortable and moved away from the security checkpoint. The 2 professional women exchanged disapproving glances but remained silent. The intern lowered her phone, apparently deciding that publicly mocking an elderly man wasn't the kind of content she wanted associated with her social media presence. Robert stopped walking and turned back toward Marcus. For a moment, their eyes met across the marble lobby. Robert's expression wasn't angry or defensive. Instead, he looked at Marcus with something closer to pity, the look of someone who'd seen enough of the world to understand that cruelty often came from ignorance rather than malice. "Young man," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness, "I hope you never have to learn that a person's worth isn't measured by the condition of their shoes." Marcus laughed, a sound that echoed harshly off the lobby's hard surfaces. "Oh, we got a philosopher here. Let me guess. You're going to tell me about the good old days when people had respect and dignity? Newsflash, Gramps. Respect is earned, and it starts with taking care of yourself." Several more people had gathered in the lobby during this exchange. Federal employees heading to lunch, visitors waiting for appointments, and a security supervisor who had heard the commotion and was walking over to investigate. Marcus was enjoying being the center of attention, performing for an audience that seemed more horrified than amused by his behavior. "Look at this guy," Marcus continued, gesturing broadly at Robert. "Probably hasn't worked a day in his life, living off government handouts, and now he wants to waltz into a federal building looking like he just crawled out of a dumpster. Some people have no shame." The security supervisor, a woman in her 40s named Linda Rodriguez, had reached the checkpoint and was listening with growing alarm to Marcus's performance. She'd been in federal security for 15 years and had never heard an employee speak to a visitor with such obvious disrespect. She was about to intervene when the elevator doors at the far end of the lobby opened with a soft chime. 3 men in military dress uniforms stepped out of the elevator, their polished shoes clicking rhythmically on the marble floor as they walked toward the main lobby area. Even at a distance, their bearing and appearance commanded attention. Their uniforms were immaculate, their posture perfect, and the insignia on their collars caught the afternoon light streaming through the building's tall windows. The man in the center wore the uniform of an army general, with 4 silver stars on his shoulders and ribbons indicating decades of distinguished service. To his left walked an Air Force general, his blue uniform pristine and his own collection of ribbons speaking to a career of significant achievement. On the right, a Marine general in dress blues completed the trio, his bearing exemplifying the precision and discipline of the Corps. The three officers had been attending a high-level briefing about military history preservation efforts. They were walking toward the main entrance, discussing their next meeting, when the Army general suddenly stopped mid-sentence. He had spotted something across the lobby that made him freeze in place, his conversation forgotten. "Gentlemen," he said quietly to his companions, "do you see what I see?" The Air Force general followed his gaze toward the security checkpoint, where an elderly Asian man in worn clothing was being publicly humiliated by a young security guard. The Marine general studied the scene for a moment. Then his face broke into an expression of recognition and amazement. "Is that Robert Chin?" the Marine general asked. "Medal of Honor recipient Robert Chun," the Army general confirmed. "I'd recognize him anywhere. What the hell is that security guard doing?" The three generals had stopped walking entirely now, standing in the middle of the lobby and watching the disgraceful scene unfolding at the security checkpoint. They could hear Marcus's mocking comments, could see Robert's dignified restraint, and could observe the growing crowd of uncomfortable witnesses to this display of disrespect. "That man," the Air Force general said quietly, "saved 37 lives in Vietnam. He charged a machine gun nest single-handedly to save his platoon, took 3 bullets in the process, and still managed to complete the mission. And this punk is making fun of his shoes." Marcus was still performing for his audience, completely unaware that 3 of the highest-ranking military officers in the country were watching his display of ignorance and cruelty. He had moved closer to Robert, apparently emboldened by what he perceived as the old man's inability to defend himself. "Tell you what, old-timer," Marcus said loudly. "Why don't you just turn around and shuffle back out of here before you embarrass yourself any further? This building is for people with actual business to conduct, not for collecting charity cases." That was when the three generals began walking toward the security checkpoint. Their movement was synchronized, purposeful, and impossible to ignore. Other people in the lobby instinctively stepped aside as the officers approached, recognizing authority and rank even if they didn't understand the specific situation unfolding. Marcus was still talking, still enjoying his performance, when the Army general's voice cut across the lobby like a blade. "Security guard," the general called out, his tone carrying the kind of command authority that made people stop whatever they were doing and pay attention. Marcus turned toward the approaching officers, his expression shifting from amusement to confusion to growing alarm as he registered the rank insignia on their uniforms. 3 generals walking toward him in a federal building was not a situation covered in his security training manual. The 3 officers stopped about 10 feet from the security checkpoint, forming a line facing Robert Chin. The Army general stepped forward slightly, his expression serious but not angry. "Mr. Chun," the general said formally, "it's an honor to see you again, sir." And then, in perfect unison, all 3 generals came to attention and rendered textbook-perfect military salutes. The gesture was sharp, precise, and unmistakably respectful. They held the salute for exactly 3 seconds, the way military protocol demanded when honoring a Medal of Honor recipient. The lobby went completely silent. Every conversation stopped, every phone call was forgotten, every movement ceased as dozens of people witnessed 3 of America's highest-ranking military officers saluting an elderly man in worn-out shoes whom a security guard had been mocking moments earlier. Robert returned the salute with the same precision he'd learned 60 years ago in basic training. Despite his age, despite his civilian clothes, despite the duct tape on his shoes, his salute was perfect. For those few seconds, he wasn't a shabby old man being humiliated by a security guard. He was Master Sergeant Robert Chun, Medal of Honor recipient, being honored by the modern military leadership he had helped inspire through his own service and sacrifice. When the salutes were completed, the Army general stepped forward and extended his hand to Robert. "Sergeant Chun, I'm General William Morrison. We spoke on the phone about the digital archive project. I had no idea we'd be meeting under these circumstances." Robert shook the offered hand, his grip firm despite his age. "General Morrison, it's good to meet you in person. I apologize for the commotion. I was just trying to get to my appointment." The Marine general stepped forward next. "Sergeant Chun, I'm General Patricia Hayes. My father served under you in the 173rd Airborne. He never stopped talking about what you did at Firebase Charlie. Said you were the bravest man he ever knew." The Air Force general joined them. "General Robert Kim, sir." My grandfather was one of the men you saved that day. Our family has never forgotten what you did. Marcus stood frozen behind the security checkpoint, his face pale with the dawning realization of his catastrophic mistake. The confident swagger he displayed moments earlier had evaporated completely, replaced by the horrified understanding that he had just publicly humiliated one of America's most decorated war heroes in front of three of the country's top military leaders. Linda Rodriguez, the security supervisor, was equally stunned but recovered more quickly than Marcus. She approached the group of officers and Robert, her expression apologetic and professional. "Generals, Mr. Chun, I sincerely apologize for what just occurred. This behavior is completely unacceptable and does not represent the standards of this facility." General Morrison looked at Linda, then at Marcus, who was still standing motionless behind the security checkpoint like a deer caught in headlights. "Ma'am, I assume that security guard works for you?" General Morrison asked. "Yes, sir. He's one of our newer employees." "Then I suggest you use this as a teaching moment about respect, dignity, and the importance of treating every visitor to this building with appropriate courtesy." The man he was mocking earned the Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism in combat. He charged an enemy position under heavy fire to save his platoon, was wounded multiple times, and continued fighting until every one of his men was safe. The general's voice carried across the now silent lobby, ensuring that everyone present could hear the story of Robert's heroism. Several people pulled out phones to record, but not to mock this time. They were witnessing something remarkable, the intersection of past heroism and present recognition, the moment when true worth was revealed despite outward appearances. General Hayes added her voice to the explanation. Sergeant Chun was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Nixon in 1971. He spent the last 50 years working quietly with various veterans organizations, helping other soldiers transition to civilian life, and raising money for military charities. He's never sought publicity or recognition for his continued service to his fellow veterans. The crowd in the lobby had grown as word spread through the building that something significant was happening on the ground floor. Federal employees, visitors, and other security personnel had gathered to witness the extraordinary scene of three generals explaining the heroic background of a man who had just been publicly ridiculed for his appearance. Robert stood quietly during this recitation of his service record, neither proud nor embarrassed by the attention. He'd learned long ago that medals and recognition were less important than the knowledge that he'd done his duty when it mattered most. The respect of these three generals meant more to him than the opinions of a dozen ignorant security guards. General Kim turned toward Marcus, who was still frozen in place behind the security checkpoint. "Young man, I want you to understand something. The condition of a person's shoes tells you nothing about their character, their service to their country, or their worth as a human being. Sergeant Chun has given more to America than most people could manage in 10 lifetimes. He deserves your respect, not your ridicule." Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. I didn't know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Robert stepped forward, moving slowly but with dignity toward the security checkpoint. The crowd parted respectfully as he approached Marcus, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the marble floor. "Son," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness, "I don't need your apology. But I hope you'll remember this moment the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on their appearance. You never know what battles they've fought or what sacrifices they've made." The three generals exchanged glances, recognizing the grace and wisdom that had made Robert Chin not just a war hero, but a genuinely exceptional human being. His response to humiliation wasn't anger or demands for punishment, but an attempt to teach and improve. General Morrison addressed the crowd that had gathered in the lobby. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed something important. Not just the recognition of a war hero, but a lesson about dignity, respect, and the danger of making assumptions about people based on superficial appearances. Sergeant Chin's shoes may be old and worn, but they've walked through more history and carried more honor than most of us will ever know." Linda Rodriguez stepped forward to address the situation from an administrative perspective. "Mr. Chun, on behalf of this facility and the federal government, I want to apologize for the treatment you received. We will be conducting immediate retraining for all security personnel about appropriate conduct and respect for visitors." She turned to Marcus, whose face was still pale with shock and shame. As for you, report to my office immediately after your shift. We'll be discussing your future employment here. The three generals spent the next 20 minutes talking with Robert about the digital archive project, their conversation taking place in the middle of the lobby as dozens of people listened and learned. They discussed military history, the importance of preserving veteran stories, and the ongoing work of honoring those who had served with distinction. As the impromptu gathering began to disperse, General Hayes asked Robert if he needed assistance getting to his appointment. Robert smiled and thanked her, but explained that he was perfectly capable of finding his way around the building. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The man who had been mocked for looking lost and confused was actually more familiar with government buildings and military procedures than most of the people who worked there. Before leaving, General Morrison made sure to shake hands with several of the people who had witnessed Marcus's behavior, thanking them for their patience and explaining the importance of treating all visitors with dignity and respect. His message was clear. What they had witnessed was unacceptable, but it had also become a powerful teaching moment about the danger of judging people by their appearance. Robert made his way to the elevator, his worn shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. The sound that had prompted Marcus's cruel jokes now seemed dignified, purposeful, the footsteps of a man who had walked through history and emerged with his honor intact. The three generals watched him go, their respect evident in their bearing and expressions. They had each commanded thousands of soldiers, had been responsible for multi-million-dollar operations, had briefed presidents, and advised cabinet members. But they all understood that they were in the presence of someone whose service and sacrifice exceeded their own achievements. Marcus remained at his security checkpoint for the rest of his shift, but his confident swagger was gone. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the building, and every person who passed through his checkpoint looked at him with expressions ranging from disapproval to outright contempt. His moment of cruel entertainment had become a public humiliation that would follow him for the rest of his career. Linda Rodriguez spent the afternoon reviewing security protocols and scheduling mandatory training sessions for all personnel about respectful treatment of visitors. The incident would become a case study in her department, a cautionary tale about the importance of professionalism and the danger of making assumptions about people based on their appearance. The story spread beyond the federal building through social media, news reports, and word of mouth. Videos taken by witnesses showed the three generals saluting Robert, and the stark contrast between Marcus's cruel mockery and the military leader's respectful recognition. The incident became a viral sensation, but not in the way Marcus had originally intended. Robert completed his appointment that afternoon, spending 2 hours reviewing military records and providing additional details about his service for the digital archive. The government historians he worked with treated him with the respect due to a Medal of Honor recipient, but also with the warmth reserved for someone whose humility and grace exceeded even his remarkable military achievements. When Robert left the federal building that evening, his worn shoes carried him past the same security checkpoint where he had been humiliated hours earlier. Marcus was still on duty, his eyes downcast, his earlier confidence completely gone. Robert paused at the checkpoint and nodded respectfully to Marcus, offering a gesture of acknowledgement that contained no anger or resentment. The lesson of that day in the Ronald Reagan Federal Building extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Videos of the incident were shared millions of times, accompanied by Robert's military record and the story of his Medal of Honor action. People around the world learned about the danger of judging others by their appearance and the importance of treating everyone with basic human dignity. Marcus Thompson was ultimately suspended without pay and required to complete extensive sensitivity training before being allowed to return to work. The incident followed him throughout his career in federal security, serving as a constant reminder of the consequences of cruelty and the importance of respect. The three generals who had witnessed the incident made sure that Robert's story was included in military leadership training programs, using the incident as an example of how true heroes often walk among us unrecognized, distinguished not by their appearance, but by their character and their service to others. Robert Chun continued his quiet work with veterans organizations, his worn shoes carrying him to meetings, ceremonies, and private conversations with fellow veterans who needed support and understanding. He never spoke publicly about the incident at the federal building, preferring to let others draw their own lessons from what had occurred. But those who knew him understood that the incident had revealed something important about both Robert and the society he had served. His grace under pressure, his refusal to respond to cruelty with anger, and his genuine concern for the moral education of someone who had treated him badly demonstrated the character that had made him a war hero and continued to make him an exceptional human being. The worn shoes that had prompted Marcus's cruel mockery continued to carry Robert through his daily life. Each step a reminder that true worth isn't measured by material possessions or outward appearances, but by the content of one's character and the service one provides to others. Sometimes the most important people in any room are the ones who dress like they have nothing left to prove. They've already proven everything that matters, earned respect through actions rather than appearances, and carry their dignity so quietly that only those with wisdom and experience recognize it for what it is. This story was brought to you by the Silent Ranks. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever witnessed someone being judged unfairly based on their appearance, only to discover later how wrong those judgments were? Or have you learned a hard lesson about the danger of making assumptions about people you don't know? Tell us in the comments about the moments that taught you that dignity and worth can't be measured by what someone wears. And if you believe that every person deserves to be treated with respect regardless of their appearance, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.